When Liz Truss first stood outside 10 Downing Street in September of 2022, she promised a bold new direction for the future of Britain, unprecedented economic growth, a prosperous future despite serious hardship. Full of ambition and brimming with pride, she intended to make good on her promise and usher in a new golden age for her country. Exactly 7 weeks later, she would resign in disgrace, labelled as the worst Prime Minister in British history, and would be labelled as a national laughingstock. The economy was in ruins, the government was in chaos, and the public were in shock. Her tenure was defined by confusion and havoc. It was defined by poor communication, and it was defined by an unprecedented series of events in British society that will never be forgotten. So the question remains, what went wrong? How could everything totally unravel in such a short period of time? And what does a head of lettuce have to do with all of this? Well, this is how not to run a country. Context of the Tory leadership bid at the time, and some background on Truss. So let's take you back briefly to 2022 and the dying embers of the Boris Johnson government, defined by difficulties with Brexit, COVID-19 and various scandals. Boris Johnson was forced to resign, triggering a leadership election amongst the then in power Conservative Party. The members of the party itself would vote for their new leader, with that person becoming the Prime Minister until either they themselves resign or the Conservative Party loses the next general election. Several candidates would appear out of the Johnson government who planned to do things differently, but only 2 would remain by September. One was Rishi Sunak, Johnson's Chancellor of the Exchequer, who oversaw important economic policy shifts during the pandemic, and the other was Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who had been in government in one form or another since 2010, seeing a rise through the ranks culminating in a leadership bid. Sunak was unable to endear himself to Tory party voters who saw him as a key part of the Johnson government and its failings, even if he was something of a silver lining on that particular cloud. The country needed economic growth, trapped in the midst of an energy crisis that would go on to skyrocket the cost of living. Sunak was seen as young and competent, but a bit boring and, frankly, just a bit too close to Johnson. Truss did not receive the same criticism, being somewhat more disconnected from the former Prime Minister, with her own more radical ideas setting her apart, which promised a new direction. She was able to make this count by playing the political game and promising to cut taxes to the tune of £50 billion if she was made Prime Minister. Political scientist Vernon Bogdanor stated in a 2022 article that Truss, quote, appreciated that winning over the membership required not detailed policy proposals, but the creation of a mood. It was literally just tax cuts and vibes. And it worked. Truss beat Sunak to the position, although whilst it was expected for her to win, she did so with a slimmer margin than predicted, receiving 81,000 votes from the Conservative Party members, which accounted for around 57.4% of the electorate. A spokesperson for Sunak later said, the reality is that Truss cannot deliver a support package as well as come good on the £50 billion worth of unfunded permanent tax cuts in one go. To do so would mean increasing borrowing to historic and dangerous levels, putting the public finances in serious jeopardy and plunging the economy into an inflation spiral. Just keep that in the back of your mind. Bear in mind that this was the former Chancellor's team saying this, so sure, it could be just sour grapes, but soon we'll see if it really was. Still, now that Truss had won the leadership bid, she headed off to Balmoral, the Queen's royal residence, on the 6th of September before entering Downing Street for the first time. In her various victory speeches, she promised a bold plan to cut taxes heavily. She also froze energy prices immediately. The public needed support with rapidly rising energy costs in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This was badly needed, but nobody knew if it would be affordable for the country to do this, and in the long term, many knew that it certainly wouldn't be. Truss also appointed one of her most trusted friends, Kwarteng, as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who Truss had worked with a lot in the past. The two saw eye to eye on many economic policy issues, and together they imagined they would usher in a new era of British growth. Almost every member of the government that Truss employed was a new face. Barely any of them had experience actually running the country from a cabinet position before. Some stated that this was part of the PM's bold new direction, with radical new ideas and people being needed to get the country out of the slump that it had been stuck in since Brexit. Others were concerned that the institutional knowledge of over a decade of governance was being stripped away, with concerns for what, if anything, would remain. Youth and passion in politics is a good thing, but it had to be balanced with tangible experience, and many found Truss's appointments to be a little light. But the government would actually have to wait, because on the 8th of December, just 2 days after Truss was made Prime Minister, a monumental event in British history occurred. Queen Elizabeth II, after reigning for over 70 years, passed away, surrounded by her family in Balmoral at the age of 96. Her death sent shockwaves not just around the UK, but around the entire world. The Queen's death was a massive event in British life. The monarch, who worked for the armed forces during the Second World War, who had handled every situation since with grace, poise, and intelligence, was all of a sudden no longer present. The last stalwart of the old Britain that people remember was no more, which firmly underpinned Truss's own agenda for radical change. The most stable institution in the entire country, truly encompassing what it meant to be British, had just been upended after 7 decades. And soon, the country would have both a new monarch and a new PM at the same time. The nation was now in relatively uncharted territory. The sovereign passing away so soon into Truss's tenure couldn't have helped her, as the gears of government ground to a halt and a period of mourning was instilled across the nation for around 10 days. Truss could work on things behind the scenes, sure, but nothing would get done until the wheels of government slowly got moving again. This was understandable for the gravity of what had transpired, and it wasn't Truss's fault, but Truss faced early macabre humour that she had in fact killed the Queen with her very presence in government. It was like the Queen, who had met over a dozen Prime Ministers, met Truss and decided she couldn't do it anymore. It wasn't a great start, and nothing was going to get better from here. So we're going to treat this mourning period as a little intermission in our story, so we can get to understand who Liz Truss actually is as a person, because looking into the woman herself and her history paints a picture of the disaster that was to come. So, who is Liz Truss? Her full name is actually Mary Elizabeth Truss, and before politics, she was a chartered accountant as well as an employee at Royal Dutch Shell. She's always been interested in politics, as she was once the director of Reform. No, not that one, the centre-right think tank. And she would start to lean into the political world properly in the early 2000s before eventually becoming a PM in 2010. As we mentioned, she took charge of a bunch of different government posts, and here is where we can see a few core personality traits that would define Truss's later leadership. Firstly, she always moves forward no matter what if she can help it, with an unrivaled and often unsubstantiated confidence in her actions. She wants to do things her way. Being generous, you might just call her a trailblazer, but if you're not, you might choose to call her naive and big-headed. The next facet of her personality is in her politics. She's a libertarian at heart and a free market capitalist, but not at the cost of her populist bend. She has her principles around re-regulation, but as we showed you with the Energy Bill government intervention plan that she championed on day 1 of her premiership, if you don't like them, she does have others. However, overall, during her political career, you'd often see her sticking her neck out when she didn't need to for the purpose of this kind of libertarianism. For example, as the Environment Secretary, Truss was one of the 2 ministers who opposed the government's plan to mandate cigarettes to be sold in plain packaging with just a health warning on the box. A quote from the woman herself encapsulates her thoughts on regulation pretty well, quoting here, "Our message must be that the state cannot do everything. While the government can help, it can never fully solve any individual's problems. The NHS can't keep you healthy if you don't eat or exercise properly. A teacher can't get you the grades if you aren't prepared to work. The job centre can't find you work if you aren't prepared to write a CV. Now, we're not here to debate libertarianism today, but you can see that this is a core part of Truss's belief system and personality. Another is that owing to her self-confidence, determination, and willingness to do things her own way, and her inability to take a backward step willingly to anything or anyone, is that she comes across as pretty abrasive. One example of this comes from Out of the Blue, a book describing the inside story of Truss's political career written by Harry Cole and James Heal. Back during the coalition government in the early 2010s, Truss clashed with Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg over childcare reform, when Truss attempted to get her changes implemented despite advice against doing so from the experts and officials around her. Clegg blocked the proposal. An excerpt from the same book discussed how her own civil servants often found her exhausting due to the packed schedule and Truss questioning them with multiplication questions for no real reason. And the final tenets of Liz Truss's personality to remember is that she was seriously ambitious, but also impulsive and morally questionable. Even before she entered politics, it's reported that she thought of doing so and that she was destined for big things. In the early 2000s, Truss had an 18-month affair with Conservative MP Mark Field. Both Truss and Field were married at the time. Field recalled when later discussing Truss that even back then she was intensely focused on her own success, displaying, quote, "the parroting of slogans, the blind partisanship, and the need to present it all with a veneer of absolute confidence." This kind of morally dubious attitude to things meant that Truss was willing to do almost anything to get ahead and get what she wanted. And that can be seen in some of her appointments in government over the years. During the mid-2010s, she would be made the first female Lord Chancellor in the office's 1,000-year history, a grand achievement that Truss was very proud of. But when she was demoted later by then Prime Minister Theresa May for not doing a good job, it left her sour for quite a while afterwards, calling her relegation incredibly unfair. This was also pointed out by academic Dieter Helm, who wrote the book The Conservative Effect, which discusses the long 14-year reign of the party and its leaders during that time. That when she was the Secretary for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, sometimes known as DEFRA, Truss had, quote, "no obvious interest in environmental matters, seeing the appointment as a clear stepping stone to bigger and better things." Former Conservative MP Rory Stewart was a junior minister at the time. He often regales a story in which Truss asked him for a 7-point plan on national parks for the country. Despite Stewart's initial excitement, Truss then revealed she wanted it in an impossible time frame, allowing no time to actually build out and develop the policies. A week later, Truss published this list as a policy position, but no funding and no legislative changes came. She was more interested in headlines than results. When she worked in the Treasury, one worker stated that she treated the department like her own personal think tank, asking for advice and guidance on developing her own monetary policy. It's unknown if it was during this time that she developed some of the economic policies that we will come to see later, but nowhere would show the flaws in Truss's way of working like her short stints as Foreign Secretary and International Trade Secretary. As International Trade Sec, a position she undertook from 2019 to 2021 on her first trip to the United States, she would give a controversial speech on a potential US-UK trade deal, a foray she eventually gave up on altogether. In Australia, who did end up making a free trade agreement with Westminster under Truss's direction, she made unscripted comments on the negotiation process. Both events were to the utter dismay of Downing Street officials. As Foreign Secretary, it was even worse. She would become notorious at the time for leaking information. Dominic Cummings, then PM Boris Johnson's chief advisor, wrote in his memoirs that Truss was the only minister that he ever shouted at in Number 10 because of, and I'm quoting here, her compulsive, pathological leaking. Always a good trait for one of the most important roles in government. On the 10th of February 2022, she met her Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Moscow as the first British minister to go on a diplomatic trip there since the 2018 Salisbury poisonings, which London blamed on the Kremlin. She went there amidst a build-up of soldiers on Russia's border with Ukraine to urge restraint. The meeting was a total disaster, according to Sebastian Payne's book on the Johnson government. Lavrov described it as being, quote, "between the dumb and the deaf." Both ministers found it difficult to communicate with one another and often talked over each other, leading to a breakdown in talks. Less than 2 weeks later, Russia would go on to invade Ukraine under the guise of Vladimir Putin's 3-day special military operation. Russia likely would have invaded it regardless, and seasoned pro-Lavrov may have been something to do with that, but Truss failed to establish even a sensible dialogue. If there was even a 0.1% chance of Russia not invading, Truss made it a firm 0. So that's an outline of the woman herself, and look at that, we're just in time for September 19th, Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral. The period of mourning was now over. King Charles III's ascension to the throne was complete, and the wheels of politics would need to start turning again. But in hindsight, Liz Truss herself might prefer that they hadn't. So, returning back to early September of 2022, and Truss and Chancellor Kwarteng were keen to use the honeymoon period that they thought they would be afforded to go big on their own vision for the country. And that started with the economy. Truss and Kwarteng had been busy amidst the mourning period and soon relayed the details of their new financial plan to the MPs in Parliament. They were totally in shock by what they heard. Immediately behind the scenes, there were dissenting voices of people in utter disbelief. This could crash the economy, or worse. They called it the mini budget, but in terms of impact, there was nothing mini about it. On September the 23rd, just 4 days after the Queen's funeral, Kwarteng delivered his mini budget to kick the Truss government's plan for growth into gear. £45 billion would instantaneously be wiped off the tax docket. But this money wouldn't be returned to the hands of ordinary working class British citizens who needed a leg up. Instead, Truss and Kwarteng's plan for growth was to completely abolish the top rate of income tax, which was 45% for any income earned over £125,000 per year, hoping that the extra money in the economy would spur growth. The cap on bankers' bonuses was also scrapped. The planned rise on corporation tax would be too. And greater restrictions were placed on Britain's welfare system, culminating in the largest raft of tax cuts in the UK for over half a century. Meanwhile, borrowing was laid out to increase by £70 billion, an extortionate increase that would cause cascading problems down the line. You have to understand the state that the British economy was in at this moment. The UK was in an energy crisis, which would soon bloom into a cost of living crisis. People had less money in their pockets, and that same money was worth less due to inflation rising faster than wages for as long as many people could remember. Lower income individuals needed help more than ever now, even more than during the pandemic. The economy was slow, but also extremely vulnerable. And Truss's reaction to this economic reality was to give the very wealthiest in British society a hefty tax cut, whilst squeezing the worse off. The shock it would give the economy was akin to seeing someone who needed IV fluids and mainlining snake venom right into their bloodstream instead. The fact that MPs were totally shell-shocked by it says it all. What's worse is that there was zero confidence in Truss and Kwarteng's plan. Truss stated that the mini-budget was a fiscal event rather than a full-blown economic statement like the Chancellor makes in the spring and autumn every year. What that meant to her was that the OBR, or the Office for Budget Responsibility, didn't need to be consulted. The OBR has exited since 2010 to provide independent analysis and forecasts of the UK's public finances. They review major economic budgets and ensure that the UK's fiscal policy is sound, prioritising long-term sustainability. It is a deeply sensible thing to have. But Truss viewed this office as part of the economic establishment. She also sacked the most senior civil servant in the Treasury, Tom Scholar, over her plans. The reality was, Truss didn't want her policy to be criticised or watered down, so she just went over people's heads. And you might say, okay, she didn't clue in the OBR, so what? But it wasn't just them. Truss and Kwarteng didn't even tell the Bank of England about what they were going to do. So Truss's tax cuts weren't costed in any way. Volatile British markets with a soaring inflation rate immediately reacted poorly to the policy changes. The massive potential increase in government borrowing caused the pound's value to start to fall dramatically, and as investors saw the writing on the wall with massive risk, higher inflation and loss of confidence, they rushed to sell their government bonds, known in the UK as gilts. Organisations like the International Monetary Fund, calling for the immediate reversal of the mini-budget, made outlooks even worse. Credit brokers began to downgrade the UK's credit outlook, which would make borrowing even more expensive, and mortgage lenders began to pull their rates entirely from British shelves as they expected a huge spike in inflation. And even worse still was the Bank of England's response to all of this. Government bonds, because they're usually a stable commodity, are linked to long-term investment funds like pensions, but with the UK's economic future now in jeopardy, people were selling their bonds, further devaluing them and putting British pensions under massive risk of collapse. So the Bank of England urgently had to start buying up government gilts to keep the price stable and to protect pension funds. They would eventually have to purchase £65 million worth of gilts that were teetering on the brink. In short, people's pensions would have become worthless without the Bank of England's emergency actions. That didn't exactly scream confidence in a brand new PM and her Chancellor's policies at the most volatile time for the British economy since the 2008 financial crisis. Remember what one of Sunak's aides said after Truss won the leadership race? Let's just remind you of what they said. Quote, "The reality is that Truss cannot deliver a support package as well as come good on £50 billion worth of unfunded permanent tax cuts in one go. To do so would mean increasing borrowing to historic and dangerous levels, putting the public finances in serious jeopardy and plunging the economy into an inflation spiral." It was eerily prophetic of the economic disaster that was the mini-budget. But Kwarteng and Truss, rather than seeing the writing on the wall and reversing the budget, inflamed the chaos by sticking militantly to their stance. Just 2 days later, on Sunday the 25th, Kwarteng announced in a BBC studio that, quote, "There's more to come." When markets opened the following morning, they went into a frenzied spiral. Spooked traders pulled everything they had, causing a total freefall that saw the pound's value fall to a 37-year low, not seen since Thatcher was in power. When questioned later that evening, the Chancellor insisted his plan will encourage investment and growth, rejecting the notion that the mini-budget was a gamble. But it's hard to convince people your house is not on fire when your eyebrows have already been singed off. And in the midst of all this, Liz Truss was almost nowhere to be seen. And this would be a theme for the PM, who, the worse things got, the more she retreated and isolated herself from others. Finally, on the 29th of September, Truss called on the government to take urgent action to get the economy growing. These were her first public comments since the market's utter turmoil, which prompted people to criticise her. Why nobody had heard from the country's leader sooner on the matter? But Truss's words did nothing to satiate anxious investors who were still pulling the plug and causing the pound to enter a doom loop. But still, Truss stood firm. She wouldn't indicate even any issues over the mini-budget until the 2nd of October, when she acknowledged some mistakes, but was determined to stand by her tax cuts. At the same time, she refused to rule out public spending cuts, despite part of her sales pitch to the country being that there would not be a return to the austerity of the mid-2010s. And this simply made the situation even worse. Meanwhile, nobody would know it publicly, but privately, cracks were beginning to show in the relationship between Truss and Kwarteng. Truss frequently went over Kwarteng's head when it came to the implementation of certain fiscal policy. Meetings between the two were reported after the fact as descending into shouting matches. Eventually, the veneer would crack, with the PM publicly stating that the abolition of the top tax rate was Kwarteng's idea, and that it was not discussed with her cabinet. But many saw this as her throwing her Chancellor under the bus by blaming him for a joint mini-budget that she would have had to have signed off on. She took to the media to try and quell the storm. Another disaster. Interviewers saw her get asked tough questions that she didn't have the answer to, like, "Where have you been?" despite promising action from day one in her first speech on Downing Street in early September. It humiliated the PM and made her look weak and feckless in the wake of a major crisis. A crisis that she caused. On October 3rd, the very next day, she would announce a dramatic policy U-turn which abandoned the abolition of the top tax rate. Kwarteng said at the time, "We get it, and we have listened," despite a tweet from Truss less than 24 hours beforehand stating she remained absolutely committed to her tax cut plan. Even just hours before the U-turn, Truss was seen still defending the abolition of the top tax rate in a TV interview. To anybody who was watching, this wasn't leadership, it was pure incompetence. And the communication was all over the place. The following week was utter madness as the Conservative government and the party at large fell into infighting. Many Tory politicians were starting to believe not that they had just backed the wrong horse, but they had bet the house on said horse, which then fell down at the first hurdle, broke its leg, and had to be put to sleep. On the 10th of October, Chancellor Kwarteng eventually had to bend to public pressure and brought forward the publication of the autumn budget to the end of the month, as the government desperately tried to stabilise the market. He also agreed on another U-turn to set out medium-term fiscal plans alongside the Office of Budget Responsibility, adhering to their predicted forecasts. But the buck stopped with the Chancellor when it comes to economic policy, and his position was quickly becoming untenable. This U-turn proved yet again that the Truss government had got its monetary policy hopelessly wrong in terms of what the market and the public would accept. Parliament returned the following day, and barely a month into this new administration, the Tory party had started to have had enough. Kwarteng was told that the government's economic credibility would be further resigned to the wood chipper if he tried to push through fiscal policy again without the support of Conservative MPs. He knew he was on thin ice. Meanwhile, the Bank of England continued buying up government bonds to stop the economy from imploding in on itself more than it already had. The BOE would cite a material risk to the British financial stability, what was left of it anyway. Things could not go on this way, setting a line in the sand of 3 days before they totally withdrew support, and after that, pensions could collapse. Truss was in a media circus of her own at the time, as she would now insist that she would not cut spending to help balance the books, despite refusing to rule it out just 2 weeks prior. She also stated firmly that government spending reductions would not come, but also insisted that taxpayers' money would be used well. All the while, nobody knew how the government was supposed to afford it all. The messaging was just all over the place. In the end, it would be Chancellor Kwarteng whose head would be put on the chopping block, despite stating he had a total focus on delivering the mini-budget, half of which was already reneged on. He was sacked the next day after being called back from IMF talks in Washington. Insiders reported that he was informed about the loss of his job through a leak whilst he was in the taxi on the way to Downing Street to meet with Truss. Kwarteng would stand aside, but Truss's credibility was in ruins. Kwarteng was the one losing his job over it, but she was the one pulling the strings. This was her bold new direction, and 6 weeks in, it was already unrecoverable. But it would soon get worse for Liz Truss, because people were beginning to see her position as under threat too, and it would all soon come to a head. A head of lettuce, actually. So it's now the 14th of October 2022, and Kwasi Kwarteng, or Kamikaze as he would be dubbed by the media, was no more. He was replaced by classic Conservative Jeremy Hunt. Hunt backed Sunak in the leadership bid, but he was a more experienced and stable presence that this disaster of a government badly needed. He understood the task ahead of him was a difficult one, and he requested that there be no pictures of him smiling to be published by journalists as he accepted the job. Hunt was a Conservative in every sense of the word, and valued the classic Tory tenet of fiscal stability as a key component of effective governance. He wasn't even particularly well liked among the British people with his track record, but he was seen as a breath of fresh air at the time, and investors hoped he would bring some order to the chaotic house of Truss. But let's not forget, he was walking into a political whirlwind. The Prime Minister would give an 8-minute press conference in Downing Street the same day, explaining that she was abandoning her commitment not to raise corporate tax. Another U-turn that was a key feature of not just the mini-budget, but also her leadership bid itself. When asked if she would resign over the frenzy surrounding her nubile government, she dismissed the idea. She wasn't willingly going to take a back step from anything. But the fact the question was even being asked this early in her tenure shows how much of an utter mess it had descended into so far. Chancellor Hunt would take to the media the next day to effectively kill off the mini-budget once and for all, indicating that Truss's plan was now largely defunct. Only the scrapped cap on bankers' bonuses would remain in the end. Hunt, in a bold move, critiqued the mistakes of the administration so far, warning of difficult decisions to come on tax and spending. It was like finally having an actual adult in the room. Even the then US President Joe Biden agreed in an unprecedented intervention when he criticised Truss's plan too. The former president told reporters, quote, I wasn't the only one that thought it was a mistake. He also called the outcome predictable, and that kind of word from the most powerful man in the world can carry some serious weight. October 16th saw the first cracks in Conservative Party HQ's own support for Truss, as former Minister Crispin Blunt became the first MP to publicly call for the Prime Minister's resignation, stating that, quote, "The game is up." He was followed by other MPs like Andrew Bridgen and Jamie Wallace. Senior Conservative Party members expressed a deep unease with the PM's tenure thus far, but did fall short of calling her for sacking. The next day, on the 17th, Hunt made an official emergency fiscal statement designed to calm the markets and investors' nerves. Not only did he scale back the Prime Minister's energy support package, but he scrapped almost every single tax cut that was announced by Kwarteng. He did this in front of a full House of Commons, as Liz Truss sat just behind him as he threw her economic plans in the bin. She didn't say a word, as the new Chancellor drastically changed the country's economic future in a far more sensible and stable direction. Meanwhile, the circus continued. Truss vowed in another sit-down interview with the BBC to lead the Tories into the next general election, apologising for her mistakes. The previously stalwart Truss, who wouldn't back down for anyone or anything, gave shades of a broken woman forced to give up on her economic plans. It was like a public humiliation ritual. But the drama wouldn't end, as some ministers under her indicated that the government could ditch the pension triple lock. This was a commitment made back in 2010 by the coalition government to ensure pensions would continue to rise either with inflation, average earnings, or at a minimum of 2.5% per year. This was a very popular policy, and with pensioners being a major voting base for the Conservatives, this would be the final nail in the coffin for the government's detractors, if it were to be scrapped. But in true Liz Truss fashion, she would go out with a bang, not a whimper. By the time the 18th had rolled around, Truss's public image had been reduced to a national punchline. She was a total joke, and her credibility was in complete tatters. She might have been Prime Minister, but she wasn't leading. She was a dead woman walking, and everyone knew it. It was just a matter of when senior party officials would pull the trigger, and even the media had caught on. The Economist had previously reported in a scathing column that Truss's premiership was compared to the shelf life of a head of lettuce. The Daily Star, a tabloid rag, ran with this idea. They took a regular iceberg lettuce and placed it next to a framed picture of Truss and live streamed it with the title, "Will Liz Truss outlast this lettuce?" They even had googly eyes on the vegetable, a blonde wig, and fake hands and feet just to really rub it in. They also published the article titled, "Lettuce Liz on Leaf Support," and the British public loved it. Truss had upended everyone's life and many people's economic futures so far in her tenure. Within hours, the livestream had 50,000 likes, and it would soon rise to around 350,000 concurrent viewers. Truss would later comment that she didn't find the stunt very funny. During this period, she stated that she had championed the right policies, but at the wrong time. It would later be recorded by one of her aides that this was the point at which they thought that, quote, "She's totally lost it." Truss would continue to defend her position, declaring on the 19th that she was a fighter, not a quitter, in Parliament, but soon it would all come crashing down. At the time, the Labour Party, the official opposition back then, had put forward a motion in the government to ban fracking. This had been in the calendar for weeks, if not months, but Tory MPs were told that the motion would be considered as a confidence motion in Truss's government. Basically, the party whips, senior members of Conservative Party, would push Tory MPs to vote with the government on the measure, because if the government was defeated, it would look like the government had no control over the party, which made it impotent in effectively passing laws. It would show a lack of confidence in the Truss government, and she would be forced to go. As this would be very humiliating for the Tory party, they wanted to stop this from happening. In truth, dozens of MPs opposed the controversial method for extracting shale gas, citing the environmental concerns. The chief whip stated that this was what's called a 100% hard vote, meaning that anyone who didn't vote with the party could be expelled from it or face other harsh punishments. Defy it at your peril. But true to form, the Truss government's communication was a shambles. It was made very clear before Parliament opened up that this was what's known as a three-line whip, the strictest kind which would be enforced. Then, Climate Minister Graham Stewart threw a spanner in the works when he announced to the Commons, quote, Quite clearly, this is not a confidence vote, which sent everyone spiralling into confusion. Was this a confidence measure or not? Had the government flipped again, like on everything else, or was this just another case of bad communication? So, when MPs went to go vote on the measure, chaos ensued like has never been seen in British Parliament before or since. Senior Conservative members and cabinet ministers like Therese Coffey and Jacob Rees-Mogg were among a group of senior party officials accused of pressuring colleagues to go into the no lobby. Labour MP Chris Bryant claimed that some MPs were physically manhandled by their senior counterparts. Therese Coffey in particular was accused of practically dragging another Conservative MP through the door by Bryant. Commons Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle would later order an investigation into the incident, but found no conclusive proof of physical bullying or intimidation. Any aggression on the day was put down to a tense atmosphere rather than a coordinated effort to coerce other MPs, which ended the matter. But it was not a good look for the government, with chaos in Parliament unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Between 30 and 40 Conservative MPs were found to have rebelled against the government by abstaining from the motion. Among them were a number of senior party members. Former PMs Boris Johnson and Theresa May both abstained, as did Defence Secretary Ben Wallace and former Home Secretary Priti Patel. Several other influential Tories like David Davis, Nadine Dorries and Chris Skidmore were also among the abstainers, as well as, and get this, Kwarteng, the Chancellor that Truss had sacked. The motion still passed with a majority of around 96 despite this, but it was a damning indictment of the Truss government and her failure to lead. Apparently, the Chief Whip Wendy Morton and her Deputy Craig Whitaker tried to resign on the spot, furious at the situation, but Truss refused both of their resignations. The drama didn't end there though. Home Secretary Suella Braverman was also sacked by the Prime Minister, forcing her to leave in disgrace after breaking the ministerial code when she sent an official document from her own personal email to a fellow MP. As she left, Braverman criticised Truss's premiership, referring to it as tumultuous. People weren't sure if Truss would last the day. She did, but not much longer than that. As the 20th of October came around, the chaos in government was palpable. The public were in dismay, the government was a mess, and now a list of 15 Conservative MPs were publicly calling for her to resign. By the 25th, the situation was unsalvageable. Senior party officials made it clear: leave on your own accord or be dragged out, kicking and screaming. And so Liz Truss called a short press conference at 1:30 p.m. outside of 10 Downing Street, announcing her imminent resignation. She said that she recognised that she couldn't deliver the mandate on which she was elected leader of the party, and so she must step down. She cut a very downtrodden figure, very different from the woman who stood in that very spot, so full of energy and ambition a mere 49 days beforehand. That's right, Truss's premiership lasted a mere 49 days. 7 weeks, the shortest in the United Kingdom's 300-year history of having a Prime Minister. It was a record-breaking disaster. She announced that a new leadership election would be completed within a week, and after just a few minutes, the sorry charade was finally over. The Daily Star declared the lettuce as victorious later that same day. Liz Truss is fairly called by some the worst Prime Minister of all time. Her tenure was defined by a short stint of pure chaos that launched the country into a total meltdown. In just 49 days, Truss crashed the economy, threatened pensioners' livelihoods, undermined British institutions, allegedly caused a physical altercation in Parliament, U-turned on almost every policy she pioneered, sacked her own Chancellor, and lost to a salad vegetable. Some would later go on to say that it would have been better if the actual lettuce was the one in charge, and she is still considered a national joke by almost the entire UK, who nobody, not even ardent libertarian conservatives, can take seriously. Rishi Sunak, the seemingly boring former Chancellor who lost to Liz Truss's tactic of telling Conservative Party members what they wanted to hear, was suddenly seen in the aftermath as the only choice. A sensible pair of hands, as opposed to the sheer insanity of Trussonomics. He would go on to eventually lose the 2024 general election to Keir Starmer's Labour Party, ushering in an end to 14 long years of Conservative rule. Truss was a major piece of the puzzle that that contributed to the malaise towards the Tory party, of which Truss's premiership is considered the low watermark. The party has since fallen further behind, with the new right-wing parties like Reform threatening to become the main opposition come the next election. Truss tried to create a new direction for Britain, neglecting to recognise that this direction was straight downwards. At the heart of what went so awry for Truss was the fact that she was the wrong person at the wrong time. Abrasive, naive, and overconfident without the expertise to back it up. She flew in the face of renowned and respected institutions, determined to do things her way no matter what, which was fundamentally incompatible with what the British public needed at the time. On top of that was a stunning lack of self-awareness and an inability to read the room. She thought that her and Kwarteng's plan could be quickly ushered through under the table without proper oversight, believing that she would be given grace as it was early on in her tenure. But that grace doesn't extend to nearly crashing the economy and causing a run on the pound. If she had tried to get her plan through in a proper budget with fair costings and an understanding of the long-term fiscal implications backed by Britain's renowned and reliable financial institutions, it might have worked. But because she didn't, she was doomed to fail from the second the mini-budget was announced. And nobody in government at the time wanted to recognise this in the context of Britain and the realities of British people. In 2022, Britain was 12 years into a 14-year reign of the Tory party, under which wages had stagnated, public services had been gutted and were left on their knees. People were poorer than ever, with the British economy struggling since leaving the EU. There was an energy crisis, a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, inflation was high, public trust was low, and the Queen, arguably one of the only people helping to hold it all together, had just died. In that context, what grace did Truss seriously expect to get? It was short-sighted at best and self-aggrandising at worst. Kwasi Kwarteng himself even acknowledged in early October of 2022 that the Queen's death added to the high-pressure environment around the preparation of the mini-budget. So the question remained, why do it all? Why not wait and seek to gradually implement a stable series of pro-market changes at official intervals? The reality is that this just wasn't Truss's style. She was ambitious and thought she knew better, but she was catastrophically wrong, and she couldn't accept it. And the truth is, she still can't. Truss would later make comment on her short tenure as Prime Minister, defending the ambition behind the changes she wanted to make, but stating that the communication could have been better, and that, quote, "We tried to do too much, too quickly." Even still, she revealed that she found killing her tax-slashing programme painful, and that she only did it because she had to. She has since turned further to the right on populist issues in a bid to recover some popularity, claiming at various points that if she was still in charge, things would have been much better for the Conservative Party, much to the doubt and hilarity of everyone that hears it. Truss would eventually return to the Conservative backbenches, where she still contributes to the party's overall vision. But some are still left totally mystified at how someone chosen to lead the entire country could have gotten it all so wrong. The more conspiratorial-minded have since looked at Truss's history of being a Liberal Democrat in her youth and claimed she was instilled in the Tory party by forces who wanted to see it collapse. When that kind of conspiracy theory is being made about you, you have done an unequivocally poor job of running things. The more likely assessment actually comes from her former lover, Conservative MP Mark Field, when he said about Truss, quote, "Her entire decade-long ministerial career had been an object lesson in relentlessly talking a good game, but actually delivering next to nothing." A stark comment from someone that once knew her so well. And so, between her attempts to justify her actions and her retrospective claims that the ship would have been steadier with her at the helm, when all evidence points to the opposite, it doesn't seem like Truss really learned her lesson from the worst stint as PM in the nation's long history. And that might be the most damning indictment of all. Making mistakes in government is an unfortunate but normal reality. You have to own it, make amends, and pledge to do better. But Truss has been adamant in doubling down even after the government collapsed. The captain of the Titanic would have had more self-reflection, but not our Liz. And in the end, they were both undone by an iceberg. Thank you for watching.